Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States. Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, led the country through the final stages of World War II and ushered it into the early years of the Cold War. Although he is remembered primarily for these momentous events, his presidency was marked by many other significant domestic and foreign policies. This video will discuss some of the most important ones and how they continue to affect us today. Early life and career. Before becoming president, Truman served as a judge in Jackson County, Missouri, as well as a member of the U.S. Senate. He became vice president under President Franklin D. Roosevelt only 8 months before Roosevelt's death in April 1945. Truman was sworn in as the new president on April 12, 1945. Just 82 days before the end of World War II, Truman inherited from Roosevelt the task of finishing the job in Europe. Unlike Roosevelt, who had been president for most of the previous 12 years, Truman had little foreign policy experience, but he made up for this with his folksy wisdom and common sense. Within 2 weeks of taking office, he met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King to discuss plans for the war's conclusion. Though they considered continuing the war against Japan until a formal peace treaty could be drawn up, Truman decided instead to end hostilities on the terms laid down in the Potsdam Declaration, which called for the unconditional surrender of Japan. When Japan refused to comply, Truman gave the order to drop the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On September 2, 1945, Japan surrendered and World War II was over. The immediate aftermath of the war saw an unprecedented release of pent-up consumer demand, leading to an economic boom. The Bill of Rights provided returning veterans with access to education, home loans, and medical care, helping them to successfully reintegrate into civilian life. With American casualties running high, the government began to investigate ways to keep soldiers alive on the battlefield. Out of this research came the helicopter, cardiac open-heart surgery, seat belts, crash helmets, Kevlar, and more. In all, more than 1,000 patents were developed out of military research that eventually found their way into everyday use. The Cold War. As the war in the Pacific was winding down, Truman turned his attention to the Soviet Union. Though the two countries had been allies during the war, tensions were rising between them. Part of this was due to disagreements over what to do with post-war Germany. The Soviets had occupied the eastern half of the country and installed a communist government there. This worried the Americans, who feared that the Soviets would do the same thing to Western Europe. To prevent this, Truman announced the Truman Doctrine in 1947, which pledged U.S. support for any nation threatened by communism. This included Greece and Turkey, which were given large amounts of U.S. aid. Congress passed the Marshall Plan in 1948 to help rebuild Western European economies, which would make them less susceptible to communism. Together, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan are considered cornerstones of the containment policy that defined America's approach to the Cold War. Truman also made efforts to improve relations with China after the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War. However, these efforts failed when Chinese nationalists attacked American advisors in Korea. In response, Truman committed U.S. troops to defend South Korea. This commitment grew to include 90% of the United Nations forces. Though the North Koreans pushed the UN forces back almost to the southern tip of the peninsula, they were unable to win a decisive victory. By the time the fighting ended in 1953, the border between North and South had essentially returned to where it had been before the war. Fair deal. In addition to foreign policy, Truman accomplished much in the realm of domestic policy. His Fair Deal was a set of proposals aimed at continuing the reforms begun by the New Deal. Though many of these proposals were not enacted, several important pieces of legislation were passed, including the Housing Act of 1949, which provided federal funding for low-income housing, and the River and Harbor Act of 1950, which authorized the construction of 96 new dams and other flood control projects across the country. Truman also established the National Science Foundation in 1950 to foster advancements in science and technology. and he created the President's Council on Physical Fitness to address what he saw as a national crisis in fitness. Civil rights. Though he was not the first president to take up the cause of civil rights, Truman was the first to do so forcefully. In 1946, he established a President's Committee on Civil Rights, which issued a report documenting the extent of discrimination faced by African Americans and recommending federal action to ensure equal access to public facilities. Though Congress did not pass the necessary legislation, Truman used his executive authority to desegregate the armed forces. He also appointed African Americans to key positions in his administration, including the cabinet, federal courts, and the U.S. Civil Service Commission. In 1952, he issued an executive order banning discrimination in government employment based on race, creed, color, or national origin. Although Truman had campaigned on a platform of civil rights, he did not initially consider them a top priority. However, he was persuaded to take action by his close friend and senior advisor, Robert M. McNamara Jr., who argued that it was the right thing to do. Others, such as his Secretary of the Interior, Oscar L. Chapman, worried that the president's actions would hurt him politically. Still, Truman pressed on, issuing an executive order to desegregate the armed forces despite significant opposition from Congress. While this order was eventually upheld by the Supreme Court, it was met with resistance from the military and the public alike. Even so, Truman continued to push for civil rights throughout his presidency, appointing African Americans to key positions in his administration and issuing an executive order banning discrimination in government employment based on race, creed, color, or national origin. These actions were praised by civil rights advocates, but they also drew criticism from those who opposed racial integration. Nevertheless, Truman remained committed to his goal of creating a more equal America for all people. Foreign policy and containment. Truman's foreign policy was largely shaped by the need to contain the spread of communism. He inherited this policy from his predecessor, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had become increasingly concerned about the growing power of the Soviet Union during World War II. After the war, the U.S. and its allies sought to prevent the spread of communism by providing economic and military aid to countries that were at risk of falling under Soviet influence. This policy, known as containment, was a major factor in shaping Truman's foreign policy decisions. The Cold War. One of the most significant events of Truman's presidency was the start of the Korean War. In 1950, North Korean troops crossed into South Korea in an attempt to unify the peninsula under communist rule. Truman saw this as a threat to the balance of power in Asia and committed U.S. troops to help defend South Korea. The war was a major turning point in the Cold War, and it demonstrated the willingness of both sides to use military force to achieve their goals. Although the war ended in 1953 without a clear victory for either side, it solidified the division of the peninsula and helped to prevent the spread of communism to other parts of Asia. Nuclear weapons. Another important aspect of Truman's foreign policy was his decision to develop and deploy nuclear weapons. During World War II, the U.S. had developed the first atomic bombs and used them against Japan. In the years since, the Soviet Union had also developed nuclear weapons and a nuclear arms race had begun. Truman believed that having a strong military, including a nuclear arsenal, was essential to containing the spread of communism. As a result, his administration continued to invest heavily in developing new weapons and strategies. Despite these efforts, relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union continued to deteriorate during Truman's presidency. In 1953, the two countries engaged in a major diplomatic row over the future of Germany. The U.S. wanted to unify Germany into a single democratic state, while the Soviets wanted to maintain a communist state in the East. The two sides were unable to reach an agreement, and the situation remained tense throughout Truman's presidency. Legacy. When Truman left office in 1953, he had led the U.S. through some of the most tumultuous times in its history. He had overseen the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, and had made significant decisions regarding nuclear weapons and the future of Germany. Despite the challenges he faced, he had worked to uphold American values and interests and had helped to secure the peace and stability of the world. Today, Truman is remembered as one of the most important presidents in American history. His decisions during the Cold War had a profound impact on the course of the 20th century, and his legacy continues to be debated by historians. Despite the controversies that surround him, there is no doubt that Harry S. Truman was a consequential president who helped to shape the modern world. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more historical tales. Thank you for watching. Harry Truman was the 33rd President of the United States, serving from 1945 to 1953. His presidency was marked by several significant challenges, both domestic and foreign, which continue to be debated and analyzed by historians. Some of these challenges included the end of World War II, the beginning of the Cold War, the Korean War, civil rights, and the development of the hydrogen bomb. Let's take a look at some of the major challenges he faced during his presidency. 1. World War II. When Harry Truman became president in 1945, World War II was still raging. Although Germany and Japan had surrendered by the end of that same year, there were still many challenges associated with the war that Truman had to face. The first challenge was the reintegration of American society after the end of the war. During World War II, the American economy had been heavily focused on the war effort, and millions of women had entered the workforce to take over the jobs that men had left to fight. However, with the return of soldiers from the battlefield, there was pressure for women to return to their traditional roles as homemakers. This led to social tensions and economic uncertainty as women struggled to balance their wartime contributions with post-war gender roles. Another challenge associated with the end of World War II was the treatment of former Axis powers. The United States had to decide how to deal with Germany and Japan, which had been responsible for some of the most horrific atrocities of the war. President Truman ultimately decided to pursue a policy of denazification and demilitarization, which involved breaking up the Nazi Party and removing its members from power. However, this process was controversial, and many Germans felt that it was too harsh or unfair. Truman also inherited an ongoing conflict in the Pacific when he became president. The war between China and Japan was still being fought, and the United States had become heavily involved in supporting the Chinese nationalists against the communists. However, the war was not going well, and there was growing opposition in the United States to continued involvement. Ultimately, President Truman decided to end U.S. support for the Chinese nationalists, and this led to the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War. The second challenge associated with World War II that President Truman faced was the occupation of Germany and Japan. The United States had been one of the victorious powers in World War II. As such, it had responsibility for occupying and governing parts of Germany and Japan until they could be turned over to the control of their respective governments. However, this was a controversial decision because it gave the United States a great deal of power over these countries, and there were concerns about how that power would be used. Ultimately, President Truman decided to pursue a policy of occupation, and this led to a number of challenges, including disagreements with the other victorious powers about how to govern Germany and Japan, resistance from the populations of these countries who resented the presence of foreign occupiers, and the cost of maintaining the occupation forces. The third challenge associated with World War II that President Truman faced was the Holocaust. As the war was coming to an end, the world was learning about the horrors of the Holocaust, and there was growing pressure on the United States to do something about it. President Truman ultimately decided to allow Jewish leaders to enter the United States to help refugees escape from Europe, and he also created the Displaced Persons Act, which allowed for the immigration of people who had been displaced by the war. However, these actions were controversial because they went against long-standing American immigration policies, and there was a lot of opposition to them. Overall, President Truman's handling of the challenges associated with World War II was controversial, and it continues to be debated by historians today. Some argue that he did not do enough to help the victims of the Holocaust, while others argue that he was right to focus on reintegrating America into peacetime society. Only time will tell how these debates will be settled, but one thing is for sure: Truman's decisions during this time period had a profound impact on the world we live in today. Number 2. The start of the Cold War. President Harry Truman inherited a divided Germany at the end of World War II, and this situation quickly became a major headache for him. The Cold War began to heat up. On the one hand, Truman wanted to maintain a strong presence in Germany in order to protect it from Soviet aggression. On the other hand, he knew that a long-term military occupation would be unpopular at home, and he didn't have the resources to keep fighting a war in Asia. Ultimately, he decided to pursue a policy of containment in order to stop the spread of communism. Containment involved a number of different strategies, such as providing economic aid to countries that were at risk of falling to communism, forming military alliances with other countries that opposed communism, and engaging in a massive buildup of the American nuclear arsenal. While containment was successful in preventing the spread of communism during the Cold War, it also came at a high cost. In order to fund the massive military and intelligence apparatus that was required to contain communism, the United States had to go into massive debt. Additionally, the covert activities that were often used to contain communism, such as coups and assassinations, were very controversial, and they often resulted in the loss of innocent lives. Furthermore, containment also led to a number of proxy wars during the Cold War. The United States became heavily involved in conflicts around the world, such as the Korean War, Vietnam War, and various conflicts in Latin America. These proxy wars were extremely costly in terms of both lives and money. The United States spent billions of dollars on these wars, and thousands of American soldiers were killed or wounded. So while Truman's policy of containment was ultimately successful in preventing the spread of communism, it also had a number of negative consequences. The massive buildup of the military and intelligence apparatus, the covert activities, and the proxy wars all took a heavy toll on the United States. 3. The Korean War. The Korean War was a conflict between North Korea and South Korea that took place from 1950 to 1953. It was one of the first major conflicts of the Cold War, and it presented President Harry Truman with a number of difficult challenges. One of the main challenges that Truman faced during the Korean War was deciding how to respond to North Korea's invasion of South Korea. North Korea had been supported by the Soviet Union and China, and there were concerns that if the United States did not respond to the invasion, it would appear as a sign of weakness to our allies and enemies alike. At the same time, Truman was also concerned about the cost and casualties of another war. World War II had just ended, and the American people were still reeling from the loss of life and destruction that had occurred. Ultimately, Truman decided to intervene in Korea, and he committed American troops to the defense of South Korea. This decision was controversial, and there was a lot of opposition to it. Many Americans felt that the United States had no business getting involved in a conflict in Korea, and they argued that the war would be too costly in terms of both money and lives. However, Truman went forward with his plan, and American troops were deployed to Korea to help defend it from North Korea's invasion. The Korean War was a very challenging conflict for the United States, and it lasted for 3 years. The war was extremely costly in terms of both money and lives. Thousands of American soldiers were killed or wounded, and billions of dollars were spent on military operations. In addition to the cost of the war, the Korean War also presented a number of political challenges for Truman. One of the biggest challenges was keeping the American public supported the war effort. The Korean War was not a very popular war, and there was a lot of opposition to it at home. Many Americans felt that the United States had no business fighting in Korea, and they argued that the war was not worth the cost in terms of money and lives. Truman had to work hard to keep the public supported the war effort despite the growing cost and casualties. Overall, the Korean War was a very challenging conflict for President Harry Truman, and it tested his leadership and resolve. He had to make difficult decisions about how to respond to North Korea's invasion of South Korea, and he had to keep the American public supported the war effort despite the growing cost and casualties. Ultimately, the Korean War ended in a stalemate, and it is often seen as one of the first major conflicts of the Cold War. For civil rights, Harry Truman was the first president to take significant action towards civil rights for African Americans. He did this through executive orders, using the federal government to desegregate the military and ordering the FBI to investigate the 1956 murder of Emmett Till, among other things. But he was also unsuccessful in passing legislation that would have outlawed discrimination based on race or color. Despite his efforts, racial discrimination and violence continued throughout his presidency and after. Why? Well, it's complicated. The short answer is that the US was not ready for civil rights reform. There was a lot of opposition from white Southerners who did not want African Americans to have equal rights. And even some Northerners were hesitant to support civil rights for African Americans. They were afraid that it would cause more racial violence, and they did not want to upset the racial hierarchy that had been established. Another reason why Truman was unsuccessful in passing civil rights legislation was that he did not have enough political power. He was a very polarizing figure, and he was not able to build much support for his civil rights agenda. Additionally, the Democratic Party, which controlled the government, was split over the issue of civil rights. Many members of the party, especially those from the South, were very resistant to any changes that would promote equality between the races. Finally, Truman also faced opposition from the courts. The Supreme Court had the opportunity to rule on several important civil rights cases during his presidency, but they chose not to take up any of them. For example, in 1954, the court could have ruled on the constitutionality of racial segregation in schools, but they declined to hear the case. This lack of support from the courts made it very difficult for Truman to make any progress on civil rights. Number 5. The development of the hydrogen bomb. Harry Truman was president when the United States successfully developed the hydrogen bomb. This was a major challenge for him because it raised a number of ethical, political, and military questions. For example, should the United States use the hydrogen bomb as a weapon? What would be the effects of using such a powerful weapon? And how would the development of the hydrogen bomb affect relations with other countries? Truman ultimately decided that the United States should not use the hydrogen bomb as a weapon, and he kept it in a drawer until it was needed. He also worked to develop a strong relationship with the United Kingdom and Canada in order to ensure that the hydrogen bomb would only be used as a last resort. However, the development of the hydrogen bomb still had a major impact on Truman's presidency. It forced him to make some very difficult decisions about the use of nuclear weapons, and it raised a number of concerns about the future of humanity. These are just a few of the major challenges that Harry Truman faced during his presidency. He was a very polarizing figure, and he faced a lot of opposition from both the left and the right. However, he was also a very determined and resilient man, and he was able to overcome these challenges and achieve some of his goals. If you want to learn more about Harry Truman and his presidency, please visit the website below. Harry Truman became famous for ending World War II by dropping atomic bombs on Japan. But what if I told you he wasn't the one who made the call? What if I told you that it was actually General Curtis LeMay who ordered the bombings? This is the host with this channel. And today, we're going to find out exactly how General Curtis LeMay ordered the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending World War II, all that and more today. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m., an American B-29 Superfortress aircraft named Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, dropped the first atomic weapon ever used in warfare on Hiroshima, Japan. The second bomb, dubbed Fat Man, would later be dropped 6 days later on Nagasaki, officially bringing to an end the Second World War. The decision to drop these bombs has been the subject of debate ever since. Some believe that they were necessary to end the war and save countless lives. Others argue that they were not only unnecessary, but also a war crime, having been used against civilian targets and causing horrific devastation and long-term health issues to civilians. For some time now, the decision to drop the bombs has been widely attributed to President Harry S. Truman, but what if that's not actually true? What if it was a general on the ground who made the call, and if so, who was he and why did he do it? The general who ordered the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not Harry S. Truman, but rather Lieutenant General Curtis LeMay. Truman had delegated authority to end the war to a small group of advisors, including LeMay. When making the decision to use the atomic bombs, LeMay believed that the bombings were necessary to bring a swift end to the conflict and save American lives. However, this was not the first time LeMay had pushed for the use of atomic weapons. In fact, it was something of an obsession for him. Curtis LeMay was born on February 13, 1895, in Lincoln, Nebraska. He attended the University of Nebraska and enlisted in the Army Air Corps upon graduation. In 1917, during the First World War, he served as a pilot and was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his service. Following the war, he remained in the military and was involved in various aviation projects, including the development of airmail routes. During this time, he developed a reputation as a capable and ambitious officer. However, his career took a significant turn when he became interested in the potential of atomic weapons. LeMay was among the first military officers to recognize the strategic value of atomic weapons, and he began advocating for their development and use early on. He recognized the devastating power that these weapons possessed and believed that they could be a game changer in future conflicts. His views were initially seen as controversial, and many in the military establishment dismissed them as unrealistic or impractical. But LeMay persisted in his advocacy, and eventually his views began to gain traction. In 1942, LeMay was placed in charge of the new 547th Bombardment Group at Wendover Field, Utah, tasked with testing the first American atomic weapon. While there, he advocated for the use of plutonium-239 as the primary fuel for the device. Despite facing skepticism from other military leaders, LeMay's efforts paid off, and his ideas were eventually incorporated into the Manhattan Project, the top-secret program that developed the first atomic bombs. As the project progressed, LeMay became increasingly convinced of the military value of atomic weapons. He began to develop plans for how they could be used effectively in a potential conflict with Japan, and he pushed for the military to invest more resources into their development and deployment. LeMay's advocacy played a crucial role in shaping the military's approach to atomic weapons. His insights and recommendations helped to ensure that the United States would be prepared to use these powerful weapons should the need arise. When the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941, the country found itself in a global conflict like never before. As the war in Europe intensified, it became clear that the fight against fascism and tyranny would require all the resources and manpower that America could muster. Among the many ways in which Americans contributed to the war effort was through the military draft. The Selective Service Act of 1940 had already established a system for the registration of men for military service in the event of a national emergency. However, it was the outbreak of war in Europe and a growing threat of Japanese aggression in the Pacific that led to the decision to activate the draft. On September 16, 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Selective Training and Service Act, which mandated the conscription of men for military training and service. This marked the first time in the history of the United States that a peacetime draft had been authorized. The impact of the draft on American society was profound. It created a sense of shared sacrifice and purpose among the American people and helped to mobilize the country for war. Over the next several years, millions of men were drafted into the military and sent to fight in Europe, the Pacific, and other theaters of war. The draft not only helped to ensure that the United States would have enough troops to fight in the war, but it also helped to sustain public support for the war effort. As Americans saw their sons, husbands, and fathers go off to war, they rallied together to support them and the cause they were fighting for. The draft was a defining feature of the American experience in the Second World War, and it played a crucial role in the country's victory. By 1945, the war in the Pacific was in its final stages. The Allies had launched a series of offensives that had driven the Japanese forces back to their home islands. The U.S. military was preparing for a potential invasion of Japan, which was expected to be a costly and bloody affair. It was at this point that the use of the atomic bombs came under serious consideration as a way to force Japan's surrender without the need for a ground invasion. The decision to use the bombs was ultimately made by President Harry S. Truman, who was faced with the choice of either proceeding with the invasion of Japan or trying to find another way to end the war. However, Truman had given his top military advisors authority to make this decision on his behalf. This group, known as the Consultado, included key figures such as General George Marshall, Admiral William Leahy, and, yes, Lieutenant General Curtis LeMay. The Consultado met on July 26, 1945, to discuss the options for ending the war in the Pacific. The possibility of using the atomic bomb was on the table, along with other options such as a conventional military attack on Japan or a negotiated peace settlement. After careful deliberation, the Consultado came to the conclusion that the use of the atomic bomb was the best option to end the war swiftly and with the least amount of casualties. On July 29, 1945, the Consultado presented their recommendation to Truman, who ultimately approved the plan to drop the bombs. However, it was LeMay who was most instrumental in pushing for the use of the atomic bomb, and he played a key role in planning and executing the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. LeMay believed that the atomic bomb was a powerful weapon that could bring about a quick end to the war and save American lives. He argued that a conventional attack on Japan would likely result in heavy casualties for both the United States and Japan. But the use of the atomic bomb forced Japan to surrender quickly, thus ending the war and saving lives. However, others in the military establishment were not so sure. Some argued that the atomic bomb was a dangerous and unpredictable weapon and that its use could lead to unforeseen consequences. They also worried about the potential damage to the environment and to human health. Despite these concerns, LeMay's arguments prevailed and the decision was made to drop the bombs. In the weeks following the bombings, LeMay played a key role in the aftermath of the attacks. He worked closely with the other members of the Consultado and with President Truman to assess the situation and determine the next steps. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had a profound impact on the world. They were the first and only time that nuclear weapons had been used in warfare, and they ushered in a new era of military technology and strategy. In the immediate aftermath of the bombings, LeMay and the other members of the Consultado were hailed as heroes for their role in ending the Second World War. However, as the full implications of the bombings became clear, the debate over their use became increasingly contentious. Many people, including some in the United States, came to believe that the bombings were not only unnecessary, but also a war crime. They argued that the bombs had been used against civilian targets and had caused horrific devastation and long-term health issues to civilians. Despite the controversy, LeMay remained steadfast in his belief that the use of the atomic bomb had been justified. He argued that the bombs had saved countless lives by forcing Japan to surrender, and that the devastation they had caused was outweighed by the benefits of ending the war. However, as the years passed, the controversy over the bombings continued to grow and LeMay's reputation became increasingly tarnished. Many people came to see him as symbol of the dangers of nuclear weapons and of the recklessness of the military establishment. Ultimately, the legacy of Curtis LeMay is a complex and controversial one. He was a brilliant military strategist and a key player in ending the Second World War. However, His advocacy for the use of the atomic bomb and his role in planning the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have cast a long shadow over his legacy. Whether he is remembered as a hero or a villain depends largely on one's perspective and the weight one gives to the ends and means of ending the Second World War. For more information on this topic, please check out the links below. And as always, thanks for watching. In this video, we're gonna look at the second major domestic legislative program of the post-war era, and that was Truman's Fair Deal. So if you're ready to get them brain cows melt, let's get to it. Okay, so just like with the Square Deal, the New Deal, and the Good Deal before it, the Fair Deal was a series of proposals put forward by a president in order to address what he saw shortcomings in American life. Only this time, the shortcomings Truman saw weren't quite so dire. In fact, some of the things he wanted to accomplish through the Fair Deal could have been accomplished with just a little bit of spit and a handshake, but they weren't, and that was the point. Truman had been elected on an anti-McCarthyism platform, and he figured a little feel-good legislation would go a long way toward convincing Americans that Democrats were not, in fact, communists. Now, the Fair Deal was in some sense a continuation of the New Deal, and that was partly because many of the same people who created the New Deal were now working for the Fair Deal, people like Paul Krugman, who headed up the Council of Economic Advisors, and Harry Dexter White, who headed up the Treasury. But while the New Deal was born out of desperation, the Fair Deal was born out of political expediency. That is, Truman was trying to get re-elected and he thought these policies would help him do it. So to see what was included in the Fair Deal, let's start with what wasn't. There were no major changes to the social safety net programs created during the New Deal, nor were there any massive public works projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Fair Deal wasn't even all that fair. For example, while Truman supported the right of organized labor to bargain collectively, his administration also cracked down on the striking coal miners when they went on strike in 1946. Additionally, while the Fair Deal did propose some measures to address racial discrimination, the president himself was kind of a racist, and didn't really do much to advance the cause of civil rights. No, the Fair Deal was mainly concerned with things like raising the minimum wage, promoting affordable housing, expanding social security benefits, and the like. Things that, again, might have been accomplished with a handshake but weren't. Okay, so let's talk about those two biggest components of the Fair Deal, minimum wage and civil rights. First off, minimum wage. Now, the last time Congress had raised the federal minimum wage was 1938 when it was raised to 25 cents an hour. And since then, the cost of living had risen by about 50%. So it was high time that the minimum wage be raised, right? Well, yeah, that sounds like a no-brainer, but remember, these are politicians we're talking about. And for many of them, a minimum wage increase was anathema because it threatened the capitalist free market system. Besides, minimum wage laws were a state issue, and most states had no minimum wage at all. So why should the federal government have one? Well, as it turns out, the threat of communism was more persuasive than the free market. And in 1950, Congress passed a law raising the minimum wage from 25 cents to 75 cents per hour. It didn't go into effect until 1956, though. But hey, progress, right? Second, civil rights. As I mentioned earlier, Truman was not a strong supporter of civil rights, but he had to at least say he supported civil rights because his administration had desegregated the armed forces in 1948, and that opened him up to some pretty harsh criticism from the Southern Democrats. Additionally, the Supreme Court had just issued a landmark ruling in the case of Shelley v. Kremer, which outlawed racial covenants in housing. And the passage of the 1950 Housing Act made the federal government the first provider of desegregated housing. Finally, President Truman appointed a presidential committee on civil rights, which issued a report documenting the extent of discrimination faced by African Americans throughout the United States. However, given the hostility of Congress towards civil rights legislation, all of these initiatives amounted to nothing more than symbolic gestures. Now, we can't talk about the Fair Deal without mentioning one of its most ardent supporters, a man whose name has become synonymous with progressivism and economic fairness. And that man is Henry A. Wallace. He served as Secretary of Commerce under both Roosevelt and Truman and ran unsuccessfully for vice president in 1940 on the Roosevelt ticket. During the war, he advocated for greater cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union, which got him kicked out of the administration. After the war, he campaigned for the presidency as a progressive Democrat, running on the slogan "a chicken in every pot and an airplane in every garage." He narrowly lost the nomination to Harry Truman at the 1948 Democratic National Convention. And after losing the election, he founded the populist political movement known as the Progressive Party. However, by the time the 1950s rolled around, Wallace had fallen out of favor with the public and most of his political contemporaries due to his increasingly erratic behavior. Nonetheless, he continued to advocate for progressive causes until his death in 1965. Okay, so far we've talked about two of the three major legislative accomplishments of the Fair Deal: minimum wage and civil rights. But what was the third? Well, that was the 1951 Employee Retirement Act, and it accomplished three things. First, it expanded Social Security benefits to include most self-employed Americans. Second, it provided federal grants to states that provided medical care to needy welfare recipients. And third, it established Medicare and a federal health insurance program for all retired Americans over 65. Now, this last one was actually the result of a compromise. See, originally, Truman wanted to create a comprehensive national health insurance plan that would cover the entire country, but Congress wouldn't have that. So instead, Truman got them to agree to a program that only covered the elderly. And thus the United States became the second nation in the world to provide universal health care for its elderly citizens, the first being Germany. And the reason I say the United States became the second nation to do this is because when Medicare was first established in 1951, it was not technically a federal program, it was run by the states. However, in 1965, Congress passed Medicare Part B, which amended Title II of the Social Security Act and established the health insurance for the aged program, which we know today as Medicare. Now, there were a couple of problems with this new health insurance program, namely that it did not cover all medically necessary services and it left out those under 65. Nonetheless, it was a huge step forward for the country. And it would not have happened if Congress hadn't been so reluctant to pass any sort of major healthcare legislation, but it was a step forward nonetheless. But the Fair Deal wasn't all that fair, right? Yeah, well, maybe not. Most of the provisions of the Fair Deal that Truman desperately wanted to see passed, like national health insurance, didn't happen. And the ones that did get passed weren't all that significant, like the minimum wage increase. But here's the thing. While the Fair Deal failed to address many of the issues that plagued average Americans, it did at least try to address them. This was important because by the late 1940s, many Americans felt that their elected officials weren't paying attention to their concerns. The Fair Deal was a way of showing them that, yes, their concerns were being addressed. Even if those concerns weren't fully realized until the Great Society programs of the 1960s, the groundwork had been laid. Okay, click here to keep reviewing for Unit 9, and additionally, I have developed a test that allows you to test your knowledge of everything we have learned in this course. It is a great review tool and it's completely free. And finally, if this video helped you and you want me to keep making them, please subscribe. I'm out. Harry Truman was known for his Fair Deal domestic agenda, which he campaigned on in the 1948 presidential election. But what exactly did the Fair Deal consist of? What were its main components and how successful was it? As many of you know, when Truman assumed the presidency in 1945, he inherited a set of programs from the New Deal. Most of these programs were created during Franklin D. Roosevelt's third term office after being elected to an unprecedented fourth term. And they included things like Social Security, Works Progress Association, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and more. So if the Fair Deal was supposed to be a continuation of the New Deal, why do we even have a separate term for it? Well, it turns out that not all New Dealers were happy with the direction that FDR had taken the initiative in his final term. Many of them felt that FDR had strayed too far away from the original goals of economic recovery and relief by instituting these new programs. These people, known as the liberal or the new liberal or the old New Dealers, argued against continuing the trend of expanding government involvement in the economy. Instead, they wanted to focus on full employment through public works programs. They advocated for a balanced budget and lower taxes, meaning less government involvement in the economy. Truman agreed with this assessment and in his campaign pledged to continue and expand upon the successes of the New Deal while not pursuing some of the more controversial measures of the latter part of FDR's fourth term. Now, it should be noted that Truman himself wasn't much of a policy wonk. He preferred to leave the actual creation and implementation of policies to others, and so he assembled a team of trusted advisors and asked them to draft a series of domestic policy proposals to put before Congress. The result was the Fair Deal, which consisted of 26 points grouped into 6 categories. The first category was employment, which consisted of point 1, the adoption of the full employment as a national goal. Point 2, the enactment of legislation to make it illegal to discriminate against organized labor. Point 3, the passage of a law to prohibit monopolies and improve working conditions. And point 4, the establishment of a federal clearinghouse for job information. Points 5 and 6 pertain to housing and called for slum clearance and the construction of 750,000 new homes for low-income families. Points 7 through 9 dealt with agriculture and called for price supports for crops, the expansion of the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act, and an increase in the minimum price for milk. Points 10 through 13 concerned the relationship between the federal government and organized labor. Point 10 called for the enactment of a federal law guaranteeing the right of workers to organize and collectively bargain. Point 11 called for the outlawing of the use of federal funds for the prosecution of labor leaders. Point 12, the repeal of the Taft-Hartley Act, and point 13, the creation of a federal agency to mediate labor disputes. Point 14 addressed civil rights and called for the desegregation of the armed forces. Points 15 and 16 concerned Social Security and called for higher benefits for all recipients and increased taxes on the wealthy. Point 17 called for universal compulsory health insurance. Point 18 called for free and reduced price medical care for low-income Americans. Point 19, the extension of the Social Security tax to cover domestic servants and those employed in private industry. Point 20, the establishment of a federal child care program. Point 21 called for free tuition at all public colleges and universities. Point 22 called for increased funding for libraries and scientific research. Point 23 called for the extension of the right to vote to all Americans regardless of race. Point 24 called for an amendment to the Constitution outlawing poll taxes. Point 25 called for equal access to public transportation. And point 26 called for better roads, more public parks, and more federal funding for schools. So as you can see, the Fair Deal was pretty comprehensive. It covered just about every aspect of American life. And like the New Deal, it represented a dramatic departure from the laissez-faire policies of the 1920s. But unlike the New Deal, it met with little success. One reason for this was the political climate at the time. Following World War II, there was a significant shift in American politics known as the conservative backlash. This was a reaction to the perceived excesses of the New Deal and the growing power of the federal government. Many Americans felt that the government had become too big and too intrusive in their lives, and they wanted things to go back to the way they were in the 1920s. This was especially true in the South, where the Fair Deal was essentially Doha, thanks to the region's staunchly conservative ruling class. Another reason the Fair Deal failed was because it was simply too ambitious. There was no way that Congress was going to pass all 26 points. In fact, they didn't even pass all of them in one session. Instead, Congress passed only 6 of the 26 points in the first session following Truman's inauguration, and then another 6 in the second session. Of the remaining 14 points, 1 was declared unconstitutional, 2 were vetoed by Truman, and 11 essentially went nowhere. Now, the 6 points that did get passed were point 1, the full employment point, for the anti-monopoly point 14, the school desegregation point 18, the minimum wage point 19, the minimum wage point, and 20, the increased social security taxes point. And it is worth discussing why these 6 points succeeded while the other 20 failed. Well, as we saw in our last video, point 1 was actually more of a campaign promise than a legislative proposal. So it never really had any chance of being passed. And that same thing can be said of point 4. As far as I can tell, nothing ever came of this proposal. But the remaining 4 points all concerned labor relations. And this shouldn't be surprising given that organized labor was one of the most important pillars of the Democratic Party at the time. And Truman desperately needed their support to win the presidency. In fact, in the run-up to the election, Truman made a deal with the AFL-CIO in which he promised to reverse some of the anti-labor policies of the previous Republican administration. Specifically, he promised to desegregate the armed forces, raise the minimum wage to $1 an hour, extend Social Security to domestic servants, and increase funding for labor-related federal agencies. In exchange, the AFL-CIO endorsed him for re-election. And so once he was elected, Truman had political cover to address these issues. It also helps that these issues weren't particularly controversial at the time. Raising the minimum wage was something that both Republicans and Democrats supported. Extending Social Security to domestic servants was popular in the South, where most of these workers were employed. And desegregating the military was something that most Northerners could get behind. So naturally, these were the easy ones to pass. And the same thing can be said of the 2 that Truman vetoed. Both of these bills dealt with labor disputes and represented the far-reaching influence of organized labor, the federal government. The first one would have barred federal courts from issuing injunctions against striking federal employees. And the other would have forced the president to submit disputed labor contracts to an arbitration panel. Now, both of these proposals were considered too extreme by even Truman, and so he vetoed them. But this brings us to the 11 points that essentially went nowhere. And of these 11 points, several were quite controversial and likely never had a chance of passing. For example, point 26, which called for the federal government to fund school construction, was vetoed by the president of the American Federation of Teachers, Albert Shanker, who thought it would be a bad idea. Likewise, point 11, which called for the borrowing of federal funds from being used to prosecute labor leaders, was dead on arrival thanks to the opposition of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Other proposals like point 10, which called for the right to organize and collectively bargain, were considered too radical by many, including Truman, who felt that it would be best to play up the moderate, pro-business wing of the Democratic Party. Still, others like point 16, which called for higher Social Security taxes on the wealthy, were seen as unnecessary by many Democrats, including Truman, who felt that the budget could already support the higher benefits outlined in point 15. In the end, the Fair Deal ended up looking a lot like the Square Deal under Theodore Roosevelt, which is to say that it sounded great on paper, but ultimately amounted to very little. This might have been by design, as many historians agree that Truman did and have much faith in his ability to get Congress to pass all 26 points. And so he probably just went along with it, or maybe he was just being realistic. After all, the conservative backlash was strong, and there was only so much he could do. Still, despite all the talk about the failure of the Fair Deal, it is important to remember that the points that were passed did have a positive impact on American life. The Fair Deal did raise the minimum wage, extend Social Security to domestic servants, and help desegregate the military, thereby fulfilling Truman's campaign promises and helping advance the cause of civil rights. So in that sense, it was a success, but overall, it is fair to say that the Fair Deal ranks as one of the least successful presidential agendas in American history. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the history of the United States, please subscribe and come along for more. All the resources used are added in the description below. Thanks for watching. How did Truman's leadership help end the stalemate in the Korean War? Harry S. Truman was a man who walked so that I could run. It is an understatement to say that had Harry Truman not been president when he was, the US might have stayed out of the Korean War altogether. Instead, the situation in Korea might have played out very differently, perhaps leading to a North Korean victory and a communist takeover of the entire Korean peninsula. If that had happened, it would have been disastrous for the US and its allies. Truman's leadership is often overlooked in discussions of the Korean War. Most people remember him as the president who committed American troops to fight in the conflict. But his actions before and during the war were crucial in preventing a total disaster. So let's talk about how Truman's leadership skills helped end the stalemate in the Korean War. First, we need to set the stage by talking about the situation in Korea before Truman took office. When World War II ended, the Korean peninsula was still occupied by Japan. The US and the Soviet Union had agreed to divide the peninsula along the 38th parallel, with the Soviets occupying the north and the Americans occupying the south. This was meant to be a temporary arrangement, but it quickly became permanent. Each side refused to allow the other to unify the peninsula under their control. And so Korea was divided into two separate states, North and South. In the North, Kim Il-sung established a communist dictatorship. In the South, Syngman re-established an authoritarian regime. Both leaders were staunchly anti-communist and neither was willing to compromise with the other. As tensions grew between the two Koreas, the US and its allies became increasingly concerned about the possibility of a communist takeover of the entire Korean peninsula. This concern was only heightened when China and North Korea signed a friendship and alliance treaty in February 1946. The US wanted to prevent the spread of communism in Asia, and so it provided military and financial aid to South Korea. The US also stationed troops in South Korea to act as a deterrent against a possible North Korean attack. However, despite these precautions, when North Korea invaded South Korea in June 1950, the US and its allies were caught off guard. This is where Truman's leadership really started to shine. He could have easily decided to stay out of the conflict and let the UN forces retreat like the British and Dutch had done in Indochina. That would have been the easy and popular thing to do at the time. Most Americans felt that the country had no business fighting another overseas war. But Truman knew that if he didn't take action, North Korea would eventually unify the entire peninsula under communist rule. This would have been a disaster for the US and its allies. And so Truman made the decision to intervene militarily in Korea. He called for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council and ordered American troops to engage the North Koreans. The American public was not happy about this decision. They felt that the president had no right to commit the country to another war without consulting them first. But Truman stood firm. He believed that he had a duty to protect the South Korean people from communist tyranny. And he was willing to risk his own political career to do it. Truman's leadership in the early days of the war was crucial in turning the tide against the North Koreans. He appointed General Douglas MacArthur as commander of the UN forces and gave him carte blanche to do whatever was necessary to win the war. MacArthur's brilliant military tactics eventually led to the North Koreans being pushed back across the 38th parallel. It looked like the UN forces were going to win a decisive victory and South Korea was going to be saved from communism. But then something unexpected happened. The Chinese intervened in the war. This was a major setback for the UN forces. The Chinese were much more numerous and better equipped than the North Koreans, and they were able to push the UN forces all the way back down to the 38th parallel. Once again, it looked like South Korea was about to fall to communism, but Truman was not about to let that happen. He authorized the Incheon landing, a daring amphibious assault that caught the Chinese by surprise. This attack allowed the UN forces to regroup and launch a counterattack. In just a few months, the UN forces had pushed the North Koreans all the way back to the Yalu River. It looked like the UN forces were going to win a decisive victory and South Korea was going to be saved from communism. But then once again, something unexpected happened. The Chinese intervened in the war. This was a major setback for the UN forces. The Chinese were much more numerous and better equipped than the North Koreans. And they were able to push the UN forces all the way back to the 38th parallel. Once again, it looked like South Korea was about to fall to communism. But Truman was not about to let that happen. He continued to supply the South Korean army with weapons and ammunition, and he refused to negotiate with the communists. This support was crucial in helping the South Korean army mount a counterattack. Eventually, the fighting in the Korean War ended in a stalemate. The UN forces were unable to push the North Koreans any farther north, and the North Koreans were unable to push the UN forces any farther south. The war had effectively become a stalemate. At this point, Truman could have easily decided to pull the US out of the war and let South Korea fend for itself. But he knew that if he did that, the North Koreans would eventually overrun the South. And so Truman made the decision to keep US troops in Korea indefinitely. He believed that it was the only way to ensure that South Korea would remain free from communism. Truman's decision to stay in Korea was controversial. Many Americans felt that the war was pointless and that the US should just pull out and let South Korea fend for itself, but Truman stood firm. He believed that it was his duty to protect the South Korean people from communist tyranny, and he was willing to commit American troops to do it. In the end, Truman's decision to stay in Korea paid off. The fighting eventually ended and South Korea was able to remain free from communism. Truman's leadership in Korea was crucial in preventing a communist takeover of the entire Korean peninsula. Had he not been willing to commit American troops to fight in the conflict, it is very possible that the North Koreans would have won. This would have been a disaster for the US and its allies. Instead, Truman's actions helped to end the stalemate in the Korean War and secure the independence of South Korea. Today, South Korea is one of the most prosperous nations in the world. It is a shining example of freedom and democracy. And it stands as a testament to the leadership of Harry S. Truman. It was also the leadership of Harry S. Truman that got the US involved in the first place. And while some believe that we should have stayed out of the Korean peninsula entirely, it seems obvious looking back that this is exactly what Kim Il-sung and Joseph Stalin had hoped for. You see, Stalin had a plan to take over all of Korea and then use that as a base to invade Japan. To that end, he promised North Korea everything it needed to win the war: men, material, resources, everything except direct military intervention. When North Korea invaded South Korea, it was met with fierce resistance. South Korea had the backing of the United Nations and was prepared to fight. This was not what Stalin had expected, and he soon realized that he had made a mistake. He should have never allowed North Korea to invade in the first place. As the war dragged on and the North Koreans suffered heavy casualties, Stalin became increasingly desperate. He began to fear that North Korea would be defeated and that his plans for the region would be ruined. It was at this point that Stalin made a fateful decision. He would send in the Chinese to save North Korea and with them, his own face. When the Chinese entered the war, they were met with little resistance. The UN forces were exhausted and demoralized, and the Chinese were able to push them back. It looked like North Korea was going to win the war and Stalin's plans were back on track. But then something unexpected happened. The US sent in reinforcements and the tide of the war turned once again. The Chinese were pushed back and it looked like North Korea was going to be defeated. Stalin was furious. He had given the Chinese everything they needed to win the war, but they had failed him. As the war dragged on and the Chinese suffered heavy casualties, Stalin began to lose hope. He knew that he could not allow North Korea to be defeated, and so he began to plan his next move. He would send in his own forces to save North Korea and make one last-ditch effort to achieve his goals in the region. When the Soviets entered the war, they were met with even less resistance than the Chinese. The UN forces were completely demoralized and the Soviets were able to push them back even further. It looked like North Korea was going to win the war and Stalin's plans were finally back on track. But then once again, something unexpected happened. The US and its allies launched a massive counterattack. The Soviets were pushed back and North Korea was forced to sign an armistice agreement. So there you have it. The Korean War was one of the most important conflicts of the Cold War era. And it was ultimately decided not by military force, but by the decisions of three men, Harry S. Truman, Joseph Stalin, and Mao Zedong. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit the like button below and subscribe for more great content. Thanks for watching.